Paedophiles have resurfaced. The allegations came to light this weekend in a newspaper report based on a new book titled The Lost Boys of Paradise Island. It's alleged these ministers took trips in military helicopters to Bird Island near Port Elizabeth, where they allegedly molested young, particularly coloured boys. But SABC News can verify allegations of links between those three former National Party ministers and the convicted paedophile Gert van Rooyen. And those, of course, were made back in the 1990s. This report, compiled by Fokus Executive Producer Alet van Rensburg-Wright.
It was on this island that the alleged molestation of the young boys took place. 3 former NP ministers have been implicated. Only one is still alive. But in the 90s, Alet van Rooyen, the son of convicted paedophile Gert van Rooyen, alleged during his murder trial that his father had links to 3 former NP ministers. Gert van Rooyen and his fiancée, Joey Haroff, made news headlines in 1990 when they were linked to the kidnapping of 6 girls in 1988 and 89. Van Rooyen and Haroff died during a high-speed chase with the police, and the girls were never found. Alet van Rooyen wrote an affidavit in the 90s after being convicted of murder and handed it to former SABC journalist Susan Puren. In the affidavit, he alleged that he and his father went to a bushveld farm in the late 80s where his father was to meet some friends. Flippy claimed he had to leave when the friends, some very important people, arrived. But he observed them from the nearby river. He claimed he recognized 3 of the 8 visitors as National Party ministers. Flippy also claimed that his father told him that he, Gert, and Joey had already kidnapped about 40 children. He also made several statements to the police and was later charged and sentenced for perjury. He's currently on parole. Alet van Rensburg-Wright, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, for more on this now, the executive producer of Fokus, Alet van Rensburg-Wright, is with us in the studio this evening. Alet, good evening to you. And it's really a story that hasn't gone away since the 80s, as your piece shows. And of course, Gert van Rooyen was really the famous person around whom all of these allegations revolved.
Yes, that's right. I must say I'm a latecomer in this investigation because I only started investigating about 2 years ago. But I was already a journalist at the time, and I remember very well the disappearance first of the little blonde girls with the blue eyes. Only one was not blonde, 6 girls, and how people in this country were fearing for the lives of their children. They were petrified. And then it was in January 1990 when a 7th girl escaped from a house in Pretoria and claimed she was kidnapped. That's when it came to light that Gert van Rooyen was the paedophile, and he was later linked to the disappearance of these 6 girls when the police found a school bag and things inside his house. One of the 6, I must say, they couldn't completely link to Gert. They're not sure, but 5 were at least linked to Gert van Rooyen, and that he kidnapped these girls with the help of his fiancée, Joey Haroff.
And of course, it's one thing for police to have found evidence, for the investigators to have connected him to those disappearances, but when Flippy confessed, that certainly would have made it all seem as if it was quite certain.
Well, Flippy, his statements were very interesting. I've read over the last year, part of my investigation, of course, is research. So I read a lot with the affidavits and what he said. Now, he was convicted of murder by Judge Lewis in 1991 after he'd killed a Zimbabwean girl. And it was during this time that he made all these statements where he said he went with his father to a farm, a bushveld farm, and his farmer said to me he had to meet some friends, and that these friends didn't want him to bring anyone with to this meeting. But then he said he didn't want to go alone, Gert said, so he took his son Flippy with. Now, Flippy and Gert didn't have a good relationship. Flippy went with, and he said that's where he saw and he recognized the 3 cabinet ministers.
Now, is there a possibility at all, because you say Flippy and Gert didn't have a good relationship, the allegations were already common cause at the time? Could this have been yet another way, perhaps, for Flippy to, I don't know, say these things against somebody that he might have had an axe to grind against?
It's always possible, especially if you think he was on a murder trial. But at the same time, wouldn't he then have rather lashed out at his father than National Party ministers? And what I find interesting, especially with his perjury trial, I looked at the affidavits, and Flippy had a specific way of writing. I mean, we are writers, we understand that. And some of them weren't the same. Flippy goes into very, very small details and likes to elaborate on a story, and some were not like that. And some were also where statements were contradictory. But he was then convicted of perjury, and what's interesting is his parole, he's on parole at the moment, expired in May last year, but it was extended by 3 years. Now, according to his legal representatives, they don't understand why. They claim he never violated his parole conditions, so I don't know. Haven't questioned correctional services yet.
Now, of course, as you heard in my introduction, there's a new book, The Lost Boys, and it sort of brought all of this to the fore. And at the center of all those allegations and even your investigation are these 3 former National Party ministers. Can you name them?
I'd rather not, because of possible legal implications, but what I can tell you is the names that Flippy mentioned, one of the names is the same as one of the names in the book, but there are other names that are not in the book.
Are any of those names that you can't mention still people who are surviving to this day?
Yes.
Magnus Milan was the one that was mentioned in the book The Lost Boys, and it was a big feature of the Sunday papers last weekend. Is that something that confirms anything you've been investigating?
Well, his names come up. And what I've also found in former newspaper and magazine articles is that they claim he was questioned in Parliament about his trips to Bird Island, and that he claimed it was business trips and with a bit of recreation, that he took his fishing rod along. That was his response in Parliament. It was 86, 87. I think we can actually check that quite easily through the Hansard in Parliament.
So these are old allegations, as you say. It's not necessarily something new. But there was also this excavation that you referred to in a beach in KZN.
Yes.
What emerged out of that?
Well, Fokus went last year after an extensive investigation, and also it was weird. It started actually off with the spiritual side, with spirits and ghosts that were noticed in the town. But then we started doing investigations, and we realized there was circumstantial evidence that there's a possibility that 2 or 3 of the girls could be buried on the beach in Blythedale on the north coast. We went with the police, but that was not finished because, first of all, the police did not do a recce. They didn't have the right equipment. They stopped digging at the point where we wanted to start digging. Excuse me. And I'd like to go back and finish. I think we owe it to the parents to say we found them or we haven't.
Because I suppose that's also the issue that we have to think about at the end of the day, that, you know, this is a decades-old story. There are still families out there with questions. There are still families who need clarity. There are still families who need closure.
Yes. And you know, it's 30 years today, since not today, this year, since the first girls disappeared.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming in to the studio. Looking back, of course, to that famous story, infamous, if you like, from the late 80s with the executive producer of Fokus, Alet van Rensburg-Wright. Stay with us after this quick break. We've got a lot more on The Full View.